now going to hear firsthand accounts of the effects of COVID-19 on networks from 3 experts representing a CDN, a cloud provider, and an ISP. This panel will be moderated by Samuel Burke, an Emmy Award-winning business and technology journalist who has anchored, reported, and produced at CNN, ABC, and NPR. Sam?
Michael, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. And by here, I don't actually mean my home in London, but here with 3 of the biggest names in the tech world in this field. Starting number 1 with Dave Temkin, the Vice President of Network and Systems Infrastructure at Netflix. Also Rob Raquel, Vice President for Network Engineering at Comcast. Hey, Rob. And Graham Kinsey, Manager of Edge Network Capacity and Operations at Google. The first 2 I mentioned, you guys are on the East Coast of the United States. Graham, you're there in Zurich. So we've got people covering a couple of continents here. Let's jump right into it because I want to know what those first days were like. Take us back to that first quarter of the year when you realized that something unprecedented was happening and how you responded, what the war rooms were like from your home to your colleagues' home. Dave, I'd love to start with you and hear what you thought was happening and how you had to react in those initial days.
Sure. So I think like any other unprecedented disaster, you think back to things like 9/11 or the 2003 blackout and things like that. You try to figure out what is the scope of this. And I think we all kind of started from a place of, okay, this is relatively small, it's contained, not going to be that big of an issue. And then we started getting reach outs from people, mainly in Europe saying, hey, how are you thinking about the network given the current circumstances? And, circumstances being that people are being asked to stay home, and then very shortly thereafter, people were being told to stay home. So, we brought together our teams to figure out what does capacity look like, and, are we in a position to help ISPs get more capacity in place quickly, or do we need to work on mitigation if that's not possible?
And did you think that this was a lot of hype at first, or did you really go into a state, Dave, of like, let's get people moving as quickly as possible and set up war rooms?
I think we jumped all over it. I think we wanted to better understand what our current situation was in these markets. I would say we pretty quickly progressed from just like, okay, this is run of the mill, let's just figure out what capacity looks like, to we have to do something, we have to convene as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, within a matter of a few days at most.
So it's interesting. I want to bounce over to you, Graham, in Zurich. You just heard Dave say that it was Europe that kind of first gave the call. What were things like for you in those initial days? And did you feel like we in Europe were ahead because the numbers were so much higher here before they were reaching the States, that it also affected the state of internet here as well?
I'd say for us, preparations for COVID-19 started in late January, probably just a few days before cases started to be reported outside of China. Building networks ahead of demand depends on us making sure that we have a good, steady, timely supply of hardware. And so it was important for us to immediately start to act in a preventative way rather than a reactive way. And so we dedicated a team of members across our group to think about the kind of issues that were likely to emerge before they did. And so, for example, we figured that the availability of hardware, particularly components from Asia, were likely to be disrupted, potentially longer lead times, etc. So we immediately expanded our hardware inventories across regional hubs just to try to mitigate those risks. And that was really quite key for us at the time.
And did that actually pan out? Was your supply chain hit, and how hard?
It was hit, but it was actually quite delayed before we started to see that. It was probably a good 3, 4, maybe even 5 weeks beyond that we started to hear from suppliers that they could no longer provide to us. So I would say, we acted early enough to get the majority of our needs well ahead of time. It was probably a small subset that we didn't achieve in time.
And Rob, does this all sound very familiar, or are there big differences in how you were reacting at Comcast?
Yeah, very familiar. I mean, for us, the Chinese New Year was a big wake-up call when we started noticing some of the manufacturing facilities in China weren't recovering from the holiday and coming back to full supply in terms of production. And so from there, that really kicked off a series of projects inside Comcast to look at supply chain, look beyond just the routing and switching manufacturers, but the subcomponent levels, understand where they were being manufactured, understanding where we thought the weaknesses in the supply chain would be, working with, resellers to look at, can they start stocking gear to keep us from having to encumber the CapEx early, as well as getting some orders in place. We started looking at the redundancy in our infrastructure and making sure we war gamed everything. We have a practice of trying to take the sort of heavy hit, high impact areas of the network. We take it out of service at least once a quarter to make sure redundancy works. And so we wanted everything working there. We started removing any biases we had, where if there were places where one path was slightly faster than another, we would bias things with meds or other tools to sort of drive optimizations in the network. We removed some of those where it wasn't impactful so that we were ready to take on capacity and be able to absorb any demand increases with the redundancy that was there. And ultimately that proved to be the trick in mid-March when the traffic sort of tidal wave came in.
And we have people watching and listening from all around the world. So I just want to let everybody know, if you have questions, we want to kind of do the first 20 minutes just asking our panelists questions. But if you have questions, feel free to send them our way. And as quickly as we can, we'll get to them. So Dave, I'm just curious, what was the biggest challenge in the end? There's what you think is going to happen and what actually happens. And what were some of the really unexpected things that actually happened?
Well, fairly early on, we started talking to our peers in the industry, both on the ISP side and on the content provider side. We had a good ongoing dialogue with people from Google and Facebook and Apple and others. But when, the thing that really was the biggest challenge, frankly, was each country was handling its response differently. And what ended up happening, and obviously we're talking about a North American, focus with this group, but, we're a global company. What ended up happening was we got reach outs from dozens of regulators around the world where they wanted to ensure that, we were going to do the right thing, that we were going to be helpful to the networks. And some took, more kind of responsibility for that than others. And so what it really was multiple days from my perspective of getting up really early in the morning or going to bed really late at night in order to speak with regulators all over the world, because they wanted to see what are Netflix's plans here. And what we found was in the countries where the regulator was, collaborative, i.e., places like the UK, for example, we received a reach out from Ofcom, but we'd already been talking with BT and LGI about what to do in the UK, before that had happened. They more or less were just like, hey, great, it's good to hear that you're working on this and move forward. In parallel to that, obviously, we had a big technical challenge, which was let's look at how much capacity we have in our different markets. Where do we feel like that's an issue? And then let's look at the performance of our customers' sessions in each of these countries. And let's figure out already, are we seeing issues? And, frankly, we saw relatively limited amounts of issues in most markets in the world, i.e. most were very acute. There wasn't some widespread issue with our users' quality of experience. But what we did see, was that was starting to degrade in some markets. And, we had ISPs who were extremely concerned about their overall backbone capacity and their last mile capacity, both, again, mostly in Europe, that as things like e-learning were ramping up, things like Netflix and others were ramping up at the same time, and they were very concerned about what the confluence of that was going to look like. And so that's really why we stayed on top of that all the way through.
And it sounds pretty clear that things maybe weren't as bad as some might have expected. But I'm just curious, were things not as bad as expected because of those changes that you made in those initial days, or just because of the progress that you've made over the years, it was ready for something like this?
I think both, frankly. I think that the internet was ready. The internet rose to the challenge. If we, speak of the internet as one holistic global network, it rose to the challenge quite well. I think the issues that we saw were quite acute. I do think that in some limited cases, the changes that we made and Google and others made absolutely helped with capacity management in an uncertain time. It's unprecedented. We didn't know to what extent people were going to be doing e-learning, what extent people needed capacity for telemedicine and things like that. And so we were just trying to be as collaborative as we can, because to your point, we didn't know. It's still an open question, really, of, I think we're going to be looking at studies about the performance of the internet in this time for years to come. We don't know exactly how well it performed like as a global network, but I think locally we saw it perform great.
And Rob, I'm just curious, over at Comcast, what were the biggest challenges you faced, and what is something that you just didn't see coming that ended up being a material issue?
I think our biggest challenge, frankly, because we build a lot of redundancy into the network, and once you sort of make sure it's able to be used during steady state, we were able to absorb a lot of the demand, even in places like the Northeast where you had lockdowns coupled with some late March weather that sort of gives you a duplicative impact on demand. The biggest challenge we had was really taking those sort of monthly practices we had for watching capacity and building our plans and building sort of 2 to 4 week sort of sprints to moving them almost to daily with a workforce that's entirely at home, right? And so I think as a culture, a lot of us were sort of video camera off prior to this because we're used to working in the same facility where we can talk to each other. Suddenly, working from home and video conferencing became absolutely critical. Making sure we had enough VPN capacity, making sure we built schedules that had change windows that were sort of conducive to the network, given that we had totally different demographics of use with much more business critical use by our residential base during the day now, to schedules that were conducive to parents that now had to deal with kids at home in addition to their load, their workload and things. So the human aspect for us was as critical as the network impact aspect. Something that really impressed me about this, and I saw this with my team as well as sort of industry peers, is 25 years ago when I started doing this in the 90s, there was an altruism in places like NANOG and sort of the internet in general. We were trying to do the right thing for everybody to just accelerate innovation on the network, and you really saw that again. I mean, Dave mentioned it, but I think you'll hear it from all of us. The ecosystem really came together well to be transparent about what they're trying to do, what they're going to do. We were accommodating, and I think it was really invigorating to see that sort of altruism show up again. It doesn't always show up day to day in business, so we were really excited by that.
Yeah, I think everybody knows here that a lot of these companies have had their differences, but it's been really interesting in talking to you guys behind the scenes and hearing from other people in this field how much people came together. It was all hands on deck, not just in one company, but people talking to people, using those contacts that maybe they had through NANOG that they hadn't talked to in a long time, and making it happen so that everything could keep on moving smoothly. Graham, for you, for Google, what was the single biggest challenge that maybe you hadn't seen coming down the pipeline as COVID moved west across the world?
So a lot of the things that we've heard from Dave and Rob definitely resonate with me. We typically plan our network several quarters in advance and to a fairly prescriptive level of detail. And what we were forced to do was really to start to look at things on a much more frequent basis. I'd say that looking back, we saw strong double-digit growth in our traffic through Q1. It was generally within our capacity to manage this, but the level of uncertainty was obviously really high, particularly for operators and regulators, to Dave's point. They really wanted to make sure that the internet continued to work well for people as they transitioned their working to home and also their learning to home. Naturally, we take that responsibility very seriously. Did everything we could to both boost capacity, but also to try to adjust demand. When I talk about adjusting demand, I'm primarily referring to YouTube being moved to standard definition by default, of course. I'd say video conferencing was the other area that we particularly had to focus on. And so, away from the CDN, by the end of February, as lockdowns started to be implemented, particularly in Italy and Spain, there were huge numbers of people who were moving to study from home and work from home. And that was driving substantial added demand for our video conferencing service, Meet. So in early March, we enabled Meet by default for all G Suite users. And later that month, we had seen a surge of 25x the demand that we'd seen in January. So clearly those are numbers that you try to plan for, but it's still a big deal, right? So this brought some pressures to our front-end servers and also to our peering infrastructure. And so as additional hardware to address that started to land through the month of March, our engineers who had full knowledge of the hardware and software stack, they were unable to freely travel to all locations. And I would say that was one of our key challenges that we had. So we had to find ways of working with remote hands in facilities and guiding what were really very involved installation tasks via video conference. And that was something that was new for us, and we just had to get creative.
I'm just curious, I'll ask this for all of you, but I'll just stay with you for a second, Graham. And just a reminder to everybody, they're free to send in their questions. Graham, any interesting usage pattern change that you can tell us about? I mean, we all love those kind of insights of when people do what. So I'll start with you and then ask the other members of the panel.
Sure. So, I mean, through February, YouTube, for example, saw growth that strongly exceeded any of our forecasts. Usage patterns were particularly interesting. they were changing. So rather than seeing hugely higher peak traffic, we were actually seeing higher midday traffic and a greater distribution of that demand more across the day. And so to put that into some specifics, we were actually seeing almost twice as much demand at 85% of the actual peak or above, compared to what we would have seen prior to COVID-19. So really a very extended day of usage as people were just making more use of the services.
And Dave, did you see something similar with Netflix in terms of usage patterns?
We did, and it's interesting because, we'd already started augmenting some of our infrastructure for the end of the year. We're already starting that in March or April. And as we looked at what our forecast looked like, we're like, okay, well, how is this going to come together? And to Graham's point, what we saw was a lot more midday usage. So we definitely saw a rise to near peak, and then it just hang out there for a large part of the day. And then the evening peak actually just looked, very similar to what it would look like before. We do see that though across more days. Obviously, we used to see more watching on certain days of the week, and it was a little flatter. And as you probably saw in our quarterly results, we also saw a lot of new subscribers in some markets that made us think also about capacity planning. But in general, again, their usage patterns were quite similar.
And Rob, same question for you. What type of interesting user pattern can you tell us about?
Yeah, initially going into March, peak was still weekend. It was still the same nights. It was more, but it was a little earlier. But as things kept going, what we're starting to notice now, and this is sort of recent, is Tuesday is sort of the new Friday, right? We've got a small number of CDNs doing some very, very major releases Tuesday, and there's a minority of them that are still doing it during prime time. And so we're starting to see usage pattern on Tuesday night almost reflect what we're seeing on weekends. And that was unexpected.
And I guess this is particularly acute for Comcast. What was the upload versus download? Was there a huge change in that type of pattern?
Certainly growth in upstream traffic with all the video conferencing going on. Downstream still dominates the overall traffic tonnage, but we've seen upstream growth like downstream growth as much as a third.
And do you think, I'll just stick with you for a second, Rob, I'm always curious as a reporter because we do get things wrong often, so it's important to reflect. Anything that you saw reported in the mainstream media by folks like me, perhaps, that you thought, it just didn't capture it correctly, that wasn't really what was going on or the story had changed from there, looking back?
Well, I think as the demographics, to work from home came out, there was certainly some speculation that work from home activities like video conferencing would start to dominate the internet. And while they certainly grew, and we watched it very, very closely because we're very attentive that those are business critical applications. The peak was still sitting at, like I said, the peak was still on weekends. It was still people getting home and watching Netflix. They're watching a little earlier for whatever reason. Maybe they don't have a commute. But I think the traffic patterns largely in mass look similar to what they did before. They were just larger. In terms of going into details on reporters, quite frankly, we were working and adding capacity, so I didn't watch a lot of news through the second half of March. We were just humping. So you'd have to tell me if you got it wrong.
Sometimes that might be better for your sanity. Dave, anything that you saw that later on just struck you as the story was different from what you were seeing play out in the media?
Say it's basically the same exact thing as Rob, which is, there wasn't some apocalypse brewing. It just generally, we grew, we all worked together, and things were great. Some of the press stories were like, oh, ISP is really mad at Netflix or at Google or someone. And at the end of the day, we were quite collaborative with basically all of our partners around the world. I think we had great discussions with all of them. And I think everyone just wanted to work together and to come together and figure out how to best serve all of our customers.
Graham, I'm curious if you can help us on this one. Data center networks and computer resources, how were they affected?
So I suppose data centers are one of the few areas of our production infrastructure which continue to require people to be doing hands-on work. So that's quite a distinction from the rest of us working from home. So what we did was we split our data center staff into multiple separate teams at each site and rotate through those teams to try to thoughtfully minimize exposure. In terms of compute resources, that was not an area that we particularly had any problems with. Our compute resources are built on top of large amounts of proprietary hardware, and that means we control a lot of the parts of our supply chain and have good visibility into components and into logistics providers. I'd say that from an efficiency perspective, we have the capability to shift lower priority workloads to use off-peak capacity and to maximize the capacity available that is really requiring peak. But until now, we haven't suffered any shortfall in compute resources, so no issues to report on the data center side.
And Graham, I'm curious about subsea cables. Every time I talk to somebody in your field, they say, you've got to ask this, but they also rolled their eyes at the same time. So I want to go there and want to figure out, why do I have to ask this, and why is almost everybody rolling their eyes?
I mean, I think that there is such an importance to our subsea infrastructure generally in support of the internet these days, and with the data volumes growing hugely as they have done over the years, naturally there is a real fascination with the outages that can actually have a real impact. I'd say from our side, we have not had anything particularly relevant to report, so I'm sorry to be a bit boring in this respect. Nothing interesting on the subsea side from our perspective.
Dave, I see you chuckling there.
No, I mean, everyone loves a good doomsday scenario, right? But that's not what happened.
Rob, any insights on these subsea cables that fascinate so many people? No, that makes it pretty clear. I'm just curious a bit more about automation. I mean, it sounds like we're talking about scenarios that maybe had never happened before. So I'm curious to see how automation played a role in the reaction. Rob, since you didn't have much to say about the last one, I'll let you pick up this one.
Oh, certainly. I mean, for the network infrastructure, I mean, automation has been driving network config for a number of years. And so if I look at situations where we've had massive demand surges or infrastructure that comes down and threatened by, overrunning our redundancy, the network is behaving more predictably than it ever has been, right? I mean, outage minutes are down orders of magnitude where they were 3 or 4 years ago when we were still doing a lot of manual typing to the network. And so automation had a big part in running a stable network before COVID, and it had a big part of keeping a stable network during COVID. Interestingly, things that used to have really minimal human interaction on the way to getting done, we actually de-evolved a little bit and drove up the human conversations, right? And so we had a lot more human interaction between, for instance, our security team and our networking team as things were growing. Day-over-day stand-ups in which the whole company was getting together to look at conflict resolution and proposed changes. And so to some extent, automation certainly drove a lot of the stability and the ability to absorb a lot of the demand. But turning up the human interactions caught a lot of stuff too, and really helped us avoid dangerous situations for our customers.
That gives me a lot of hope for employment numbers. Graham, was that similar for you? Was there maybe an uptick in having to have those face-to-face, albeit via camera conversations as opposed to automation, or did the automation really tick up?
Well, with the CDN that we operate, we are lucky enough to partner with many different internet providers across the world, and that is something that really plays well towards automation. And so when we're looking at the CDN and understanding what we should be doing to scale it in different locations, we're making full use of all of the data available. So in this situation, because we could see things moving faster than automation would start to detect it, we're essentially just taking steps to make sure that we would lower, for example, the utilization at which we would start to plan for an upgrade. And we'll be engaging some of those partner networks to prime them ahead of time. I suppose one of the key things there, which is quite aside from automation, but kind of flowed into it, we reached out to a lot of internet providers around the world to ask for their insights about the kind of practical constraints that they were experiencing on the ground. It's all well and good for us to sit on hardware that we can ship to a given destination. What if we can't actually get it there because of logistics? What if we can't actually deliver it to site because it's not manned? What if the field engineers for that ISP are not able to actually go on the road and actually get that installed? So I think tapping into those internet providers and then bringing in, essentially crowdsourcing their inputs into our automation system, using that as an additional kind of signal layer to define where our priorities should be. That was one of the things that we made some changes to in terms of automation.
And Dave, I'm curious how much this question about automation even applies to Netflix.
Oh, and we do tons of automation. The person who introduced this panel runs a lot of network automation for us. It absolutely allowed us to deploy our infrastructure, where we could as quickly as we possibly could, in a way that if everything was manual, we never would have been able to do. And our automation runs the entire process, both in how we interconnect with networks and when we put caches inside of networks, all the way from when a network requests it through how it gets from either whether it's a cache or an interconnect, through how that cache or that interconnect gets configured, if it's a cache, how it gets filled, how it gets shipped, how it gets installed. All of those pieces are automated almost as much as we possibly can, which allows us to run a very lean team, which especially right now is incredibly important. That we are a relatively small team that can share context very rapidly because of that, which allows us to respond to things very quickly. And so all of those things kind of came together. And I think that automation absolutely drove the quality of our response and the speed of it, for sure.
And Dave, that kind of sets me up perfectly for the next question that I wanted to ask you, because there's been a debate among tech journalists and in your field as well about, was it really the protocols of the internet all of those years ago that allowed for things to go smoothly throughout the COVID crisis, or was it more about the widespread deployment of cache, like the Google global cache, which certainly, I'll ask Graham about. What do you think really made the backbone strong?
I wish I could like share my screen and like put up the meme that's like, why not both? Because it is absolutely both. I think that, you look back to our internet forefathers, the people who designed and first implemented so many of the protocols that we use today that we have, obviously evolved and expanded upon. Those were built for the fault tolerance that we needed and to be able to work in a world where there may be congestion, there may be contention for the network. And so that, plus also the fact that many of the large users of bandwidth have, reduced their reliance on backbone networks, which then increases the velocity of getting additional capacity out there. There's fewer things to upgrade, it's easier to do. I think absolutely contributed to that. And so I think it all comes together and puts us in a position where we've seen that the internet can scale and grow even in crisis.
And Rob or Graham, similar, I'll let you guys jump in. Is similar answer though? Is it just both? The meme is correct? Rob, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that's the case, right? I mean, you've got reliable transport to deal with any sort of micro congestions or congestion that might have been there in the beginning. We have great load sharing schemas to be able to traffic engineer and sort of make sure we can absorb demand. And then we, obviously placement of content in the right places to get them close to customers, as both of these guys know better than I do, is also critical to experience. And so absolutely both.
Graham, anything different there, or should I move on to the next question?
I'd agree with everything we've just heard. I'd just give a quick shout out to the folks involved in the codecs, right? Because essentially trying to make sure that we're optimal in what we are transmitting across the internet is also key. And both Netflix and Google and many other companies, in our case, YouTube is a prime driver of this, working really hard to make sure that codecs are put in place to be efficient with the data that we're transferring for people's entertainment.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. Just to add, is that we've worked with industry partners all over the spectrum. We've worked as hard as we possibly can to make Netflix look as great as possible in as little bandwidth as possible. And so if you look at some of our codecs, over the years, we've actually used less bandwidth for significantly better video quality because that space just continues to evolve. And so the fact that when those technologies are available, and we've helped develop some of them, we implement them as quickly as we possibly can. We think that's important to our member experience. We think it's important to our partner networks, reduces their cost to deliver our traffic, and just generally provides people with a better experience.
So we have questions coming in from the audience, and Dave, there's one specifically for you, so we'll stay with you for a second. In a previous talk slide from Nokia, it seemed Netflix traffic growth moved much more toward peering links versus local cache. Can you talk about this and give some insight into why this might have happened, Dave?
Sure, I'll give you the might have happened answer. See Rob laughing. When we deploy caches and networks, we generally deploy that to demand. And, frankly, we'll give a cache to a network that wants it, meeting certain very minimal criteria, and we'll give them as much capacity as we think that they need for some reasonable amount of time, which will then allow them to grow into that capacity. And then we work with them on an ongoing basis to plan adding additional capacity going forward. But those tend to be the places of the most capacity contention, the deepest it goes into the network. And so what happened in some cases was that some of that traffic then fell back onto peering links because the caches at the edge were quite well utilized. And that in concert with just changing viewing patterns meant that, our system had to adjust and adapt. And we've worked with partners. We very rapidly shipped some of them caches that needed them as quickly as possible. And we're thinking about now, what does capacity planning look like for the next 6 to 12 months to avoid that. But that shows, again, the internet is robust. It's not that Netflix degraded. It's not that Google or other things degraded. It's that the traffic shifted around to paths that we all thought we might need, and so we built them.
Graham, I'd like to pick up with you on the next question because you alluded to this at the top of the discussion. People want to know how the supply chain effects are being accounted for now, and are they still as prevalent? Since you talked about the effects having that lag, on that at the first part of all this.
No, I'd say we're not having issues anymore. From our perspective, it's probably a good, I would say, 4 to 5 weeks since we started to see significant relief on the supply chain side. A lot of that would come down to where we were procuring our hardware from. And so I think what we looked at was what creative means are available for us to divert around particular hotspots, particular areas that are suffering right now and have clearly locked down. So generally speaking, the sourcing hardware eased up quite some time ago. As you can imagine, though, in terms of forward logistics and us being able to move that hardware out towards internet providers, in our case, that continued to be constrained, and in some cases still is. If you look at the widely publicized lockdown across India, clearly, the kind of equipment that we were looking to send in was not critical equipment, as is food and means for life. And therefore, we really had to take a back seat there and wait that out. Even those are now starting to lift, and so therefore we're in a better position at this point. And
Rob, is that a similar situation for you? And I'm curious about future upgrades to systems. Have those had to be delayed at all as a result of the supply chain?
No, I mean, taking this sudden increase in demand, we essentially grew by a few quarters in 2 weeks, right? And so good news is a lot of future upgrades are done, right? We're still watching growth, and we'll respond as we can. And I think in our sense that the supply chain is look like they're largely behind us. We still have some key milestones before the end of the second quarter where we're expecting some deliveries. And if you look at the subcomponent level, there's still some sort of trickling of constraints moving through the system. But we feel pretty good. I think we've been really fortunate to be able to have good transparency from our routing and switching and optical vendors, fairly good contact down their supply chain with subcomponent manufacturers, so we understand what's going on the ground there. And good business relationships with people like, VARs, where we need to, if we want to sort of bulk up without sort of extending the CapEx ourselves, that's a great way to sort of get some hardware going in the pipeline so we stay ahead of demand. So we feel pretty good at this point, and over the next month, we'll be able to ground that assessment.
And Graham, just so I'm clear, hardware retirement, does that change the timeline? Going back to you for a second?
Yeah, for sure. It was one of the aspects that we moved towards. So one particular aspect that we addressed was hardware failures that were outstanding that we had to prioritize. We did that. We also adjusted our automation to move more quickly. But you're absolutely right. The retirement of existing platforms was something that we looked at closely. The last thing you want to do when you have a lot of uncertainty in the system is to back away hardware that is serving a useful purpose today. So we did take the decision to defer the retirement of platforms in a few different spaces, just to make sure that we had additional headroom.
We're getting more questions in. So Dave, I'll bounce back to you. How has this experience changed designs, operations, planning, and logistics going forward from this point?
Logistics, we've had similar supply chain issues that other people mentioned. That's probably the biggest thing that's changed for us, is just thinking about, well, first of all, with the fact that there's very little commercial air traffic right now, one of the main ways that we ship our caches is via commercial freight. And one of the main, commercial freight carriers is like, United and American Airlines. That's the best ways to get, and Delta to get, a server from here to Hong Kong, for example. And so we've had to think about how can we get cargo space booked on the larger, cargo carriers to get our servers shipped. But in the larger scheme of things, I think that what we're thinking about is like, how can we just be better prepared from a communications perspective? How can we communicate better with our partners? How can we communicate better with regulators? If this happened again in some form, at the end of the day, speaking with, dozens of regulators around the world just doesn't scale. And so, some of them have unique problems depending on the market, but others have very similar problems to others. And so I think figuring out how to kind of up that cooperation layer beyond the NANOG and the RIPES and the other, network groups of the world up to the regulator level who would have an interest in this, I think would help us a lot in the future. It would help all networks a lot in the future. Just so that they can get their questions answered, so they can know that we're working with them and we're working, to make the internet as a whole as stable as possible.
Yeah, and working here in Europe, reporting here in Europe, it's certainly a concern that I hear from a lot of tech companies, just dealing with the very many regulators that they have here across the European Union, or for as long as I in the UK. And
absolutely. I mean, Europe is a great example where you have the EU has a regulator that is, specific to internet and telecom, but also then each country in many cases have their own regulators as well.
Rob, I just want to put that same question to you from the audience member. Designs, operations, planning, logistics, going forward, how has that all been affected by this crisis?
I think in some regard, it really strengthened our resolve to stick to some practices that we had going in, which is around, again, constant wargaming. People, the term chaos monkey was popular a few years ago. This is much more well orchestrated and much more intentful, but taking infrastructure out of service as frequently as we can during peak times so we know everything works has been something that we've absolutely committed to again, because it really proved here. From an operations standpoint, I think we certainly doubled down on the coordination and planning around impactful network change. Because we were, very sensitive to the changing sort of usage patterns of our users. And I'd love to see those practices continue to sort of stay very, very tightly engaged across disciplines and not let it fall back to sort of siloed change control processes like you might see in sort of a standard BAU operating mode. On a more personal note for the team, I think, we've been at Comcast, we've been pretty poor about remote working. It's something that we do as an exception, not as a rule. And this has certainly opened our eyes that collaboration can be very, very successful. So I'm imagining we'll probably come back to the office with a little more flexibility, like my partners in this panel already have, and we'll look at that much more intently.
Well, I'll stay with you then for a second, Rob, because somebody asked, how did you and your teams balance new work demands with new demands and stresses outside of work? So we talked before, and you talked about this is kind of new for you, work from home in the Comcast culture. So any personal anecdotes or people walking in the middle of conferences, a la the professor in South Korea with the baby and the mom flying through the door?
Yeah, I mean, sure. There was all sorts of that stuff. I think, we went into this thing as a network engineering team, fully committing to the, success and safety of our team first, right? And if you take care of that, the rest of it takes care of itself. And so when you look across a fairly large team, the varying needs of people, you really can't accommodate everyone's individual needs and still end up with a pretty wide coverage plan for the network, right? Because people have different sort of obligations in life. And so, there's plenty of stories of people, kids running by, or people, hearing screaming babies and dogs barking and sort of the standard stuff you sort of hear about in conference calls forever. But by and large, one of the things we had to focus on was really telling people to unplug. I mean, when you get used to that video screen right there and the laptop right there, it's easy to sort of get into that every 8 minutes, checking what's going on with the network sort of mode. And so getting people to take vacation was a little tougher than we thought it would be, right?
Yeah.
And so making sure people punched out, spent that really long quality time with their families, that was something we were attentive to that I didn't anticipate needing to do that going in.
Yeah, and Dave, I know you have something to add to this, and I'll just share anecdotally. We're two people here. My fiance works in finance. In the first weeks, we realized that the workday was getting so much longer, as so many people have experienced, and just using things like Alexa, I won't say her name because she's right here, setting the daily reminder, okay, lunch at 12:15, that's actually been a huge help to us. Dave, I know that Netflix has long had a work from home type of culture, so I'm curious to see how that's, if this is all old pat for you or what changes you experienced.
It's actually interesting you say that, because we our culture deck and the culture memo that followed it say, you can work from anywhere and you can work at any time. But at the end of the day, if you've got a large company of people you're coordinating, the best place to coordinate them is at an office. And so, some parts of the company will work from home. Our entire content delivery team has been kind of work from home first from day one. We recognize this is a global internet. let's figure out, how to leverage the best talent from around the world and let them work where they want to work. So we've actually kind of been instructed with the rest of the company of like, okay, how can you scale this? How can you make this work long term, not just temporary? The big issue though is like, there's the part of the company that deals with technology, and then there's the part of the company that makes content. And it's really hard to film a movie from at home. You do see some things have been put together, on broadcast TV, you see stuff, but even there's a couple Netflix shows that have been put together basically from home, but that can't continue, right? We have to get production restarted. And so even at the end of the day, we're going to have a lot of people who can work from home, but in the same way that, Comcast has service techs that still have to go to people's homes, and just in general, they have a locale they need to work at. We're going to have very similar problems that, we're working with the industry to come up with best practices to overcome so that we can get back to making content.
Graham, I'm curious to see how this has affected Google. I mean, we've long heard that it's been a flexible workforce. You're based in Zurich. What's the work from home, work from office culture change been like for your company?
I'd say that we've got a good culture of working from home in terms of attending many meetings outside of hours, right? With a distributed team working across time zones, as is true with many people. That requires a certain degree of sacrifice. It also requires a good degree of self-discipline to try to maintain work-life balance. And so what we've seen is, as with many technology companies, we've had a really generous carers leave allowance made available to us. We've been encouraging team members to make use of that, to make sure that they take time for themselves. It's amazing how, to the points made earlier around, and as you said about days getting longer, people's kind of dutiful nature and their professionalism leads them to end up working longer in these kind of alien surroundings, right? So it's been really important to recognize that and to try to set an example and encourage people to take that time off. So for example, I'd say there have been various days in the last few weeks where I'll have taken a half day or a full day, and then I'll reach out to the team and let them know I am taking that time, and I'd encourage you to do likewise. Just make sure that you do maintain that balance.
Absolutely. For my part, I started hosting a TV show called #WFH Work From Home. So I'm liking the work from home culture, and it's certainly been good journalistic opportunity and challenge for me in figuring out new ways to do things and cheap little USB microphone cables that have made a huge difference. But I really want to thank you, Dave, Graham, Rob from Netflix, Google, and Comcast, respectively. Thanks for joining us here today, and thanks for sharing your insights that you've experienced since COVID-19 has affected all parts of the world. I hope you guys stay safe and that we can see you again in October, wherever that may be. Thanks, guys.